He walked past clusters of stunned onlookers, past the tables where people whispered his name in disbelief. At the center of the room, a string quartet played softly, but even their music seemed to bend toward the boy's progress. Halfway across the ballroom, Ethan stumbled slightly. Charles bent instinctively, ready to catch him, but Ethan shook his head. "I've got it," he said, his voice steady in a way Maya had never heard before. He straightened, adjusted his footing, and continued toward the raised dais where the evening's guest speakers stood. When he reached the final step leading up to the platform, he paused only briefly before climbing it, slowly, carefully, but entirely on his own. From her place in the crowd, Maya's vision blurred with tears. She wasn't the only one. Eleanor stood near the back, her chin lifted but her eyes shining. Even several of Charles's most critical associates were watching with expressions stripped of their usual cynicism. And Charles was looking at his son as though seeing him for the very first time, his pride unmistakable. When the applause broke out, it was thunderous. Ethan turned, searching the crowd until he found Maya, and the smile that spread across his face was so full of joy that it seemed to light the entire room. Without hesitation, he lifted a hand and pointed at her. "She's the reason I can do this," he said, his young voice carrying clearly over the clapping. The crowd turned as one, eyes settling on Maya. A murmur swelled, admiration, curiosity, even shame from those who had once looked at her with nothing but dismissal. Charles descended from the dais, crossed the space to her, and for the first time in their long, strained acquaintance, he spoke words that Maya had never expected to hear. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You did what I thought was impossible. You gave my son his legs, and you gave him his confidence." He hesitated, as if unused to the shape of gratitude on his tongue, then added, "Thank you, Maya." In that moment, all the humiliation, all the battles fought in whispers and shadows, felt worth it. Ethan's triumph was hers, but more than that, it was his victory over the limits the world, and even his own father, had placed on him. By the end of the night, as they left the ballroom under the glittering lights of the city, Maya walked a few steps behind father and son, watching them move side by side. For the first time, Charles didn't guide Ethan's steps. He simply walked with him. And for the first time, Maya felt that perhaps, in this house of marble and shadows, something truly human had taken root. Ethan reached the final stretch, the wide open space leading to the fountain. His steps faltered as fatigue began to bite, but he lifted his gaze toward Maya, who was waiting with her hands slightly extended. "You're almost there," she said softly, and he nodded. The last 3 steps were unsteady, each one a small war against gravity. But when his foot finally touched the marble edge of the fountain, a smile broke across his face that was brighter than the gray sky above. The sound of applause startled them both. Maya turned, eyes widening to see Charles descending the stone steps into the courtyard. His clapping was slow, deliberate, almost theatrical, but his face was unreadable, caught between pride and disbelief. "Well," he said when he reached them, his gaze fixed on Ethan, "it seems my son can walk." He crouched in front of the boy, searching his face as if to confirm the reality. "How long?" he asked, the question directed at Maya, but his eyes still locked on Ethan's. Maya met his gaze without flinching. "Since the day you told me I couldn't help him," she said simply. For a long moment the 3 of them stood there, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Then Charles rose, his expression still guarded, and without another word, he took Ethan's hand and began walking him back toward the house, not carrying him, but walking beside him. From the balcony, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. She knew the war inside her brother's head had only just begun, the walk that changed everything. The weeks that followed the courtyard walk were different in ways Maya could feel but could not fully name. Charles Whitmore no longer looked through her as if she were invisible, nor did he bark orders with the same cold detachment. Instead, he lingered longer at breakfast, watching Ethan navigate small steps from the kitchen to the table. When Maya entered the room, and his gaze often shifted to her, measuring, searching, as though trying to understand the precise alchemy she had worked on his son. But Charles was not a man who handed out words of gratitude easily. And so his silence remained, even as his actions began to change. He no longer dismissed Ethan's attempts as futile, no longer insisted on the wheelchair for short distances. He began to let Ethan try, sometimes beside Maya, sometimes beside him. Eleanor, for her part, became an unlikely ally. One afternoon she found Maya polishing the silver in the dining room and simply said, "There's a charity gala next month. Charles will take Ethan." Maya straightened, unsure what that had to do with her. Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "I expect Ethan will need someone there who believes in him." Maya understood then. This would not just be another social event. This would be a stage, a test, and a revelation rolled into one. When the night of the gala arrived, the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel gleamed under chandeliers, the air thick with perfume, laughter, and the low hum of classical music. The city's wealthiest elites drifted through the room in tailored tuxedos and glittering gowns, glasses of champagne in hand. Whispers had already spread about Ethan Whitmore's attendance. Most knew the boy as the frail heir who had never walked without support. Guests expected to see him wheeled in by an attendant, as always. But that night, when the tall double doors opened, it was Charles himself who entered with Ethan at his side, one large hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. And Ethan was walking. The change in the air was instantaneous. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned. A ripple of astonishment moved through the room as Ethan took careful, deliberate steps across the polished floor, his eyes focused ahead. Maya followed a few paces behind, her heart pounding, ending in time with the click of his shoes on marble. In an elegant courtyard with manicured lawns, a young black woman dressed in a dark blue maid's uniform with a white apron is kneeling on the stone pathway, holding the hand of a young boy who is sitting on the ground crying. The boy, wearing a gray shirt, jeans, and a navy blue sweater draped over his shoulders, appears to have fallen. Behind them, a man in a navy blue suit with a light blue shirt stands mid-step, mouth open in shock or anger, looking directly at the scene. The background features white columns, decorative stone planters with greenery, and a reflecting pond, suggesting a luxurious estate. The atmosphere conveys urgency, concern, and tension. Breaking the barrier. The tension in the Whitmore mansion had become a living thing, pulsing through the marble halls and whispering through the drawn curtains. It was no longer a question of whether Charles knew what Maya had been doing with Ethan. He knew. The real question was whether he would allow it to continue or crush it before it reached its inevitable conclusion. Charles was a man built on absolutes. People were either valuable or expendable, trustworthy or suspect. Yet Maya had forced her way into a space in his mind where those clean divisions no longer fit. That unsettled him more than he would admit, even to himself. The breaking point came on a gray Saturday morning. Heavy clouds pressed low over the estate and the garden glistened with the remnants of dawn rain. Maya found Ethan in the hidden rose garden as usual, his energy buzzing with anticipation. For weeks now, his progress had been remarkable. He could walk short distances unaided, balance for longer periods, and even attempt small turns without falling. But what she planned for today was something they had never tried before, a walk from the garden's far archway all the way to the marble fountain in the main courtyard. It was a distance that, for Ethan, might as well have been a mile. She didn't know that Charles was already watching. Hidden behind one of the upper balcony's stone balustrades, he stood with Eleanor at his side. She had lured him there with nothing more than a quiet statement over breakfast. "If you want to know the truth about your son, you might want to be in the East Wing by 9 o'clock. He had pretended indifference, but now he found himself leaning forward, his eyes locked on the boy below. Maya began by kneeling in front of Ethan, holding both his hands firmly. "We'll go slow," she said, in that steady, reassuring tone he had come to trust more than any doctor's instructions. "One step at a time. Remember, look ahead, not down." Ethan nodded, his small jaw set in a determination far beyond his years. She let go of one hand, then the other, stepping back just enough to give him space. The first few steps were halting, almost uncertain, but then something shifted. His movements became steadier, the rhythm of his footsteps evening out. Each stride carried the weight of months of struggle, of countless falls, of whispered encouragement in the early morning light. Halfway through, his breathing grew heavier, and for a moment he wavered. But Maya's voice, calm, measured, unwavering, guided him forward. She didn't rush him, she never did. She knew his limits and how to push them without breaking him. From the balcony, Charles's grip on the stone railing tightened. He had spent years believing his son's legs would never bear him without assistance. Years convinced that progress would come only through the most expensive therapies, the most advanced medical interventions. And yet, here was this woman, this maid he had humiliated, insulted, and all but dismissed, doing what those resources had failed to achieve. Eleanor's sidelong glance carried no triumph, only a quiet "I told you so." For a long moment, Charles remained silent, his gaze fixed on Ethan. Then, in a tone so quiet it nearly disappeared into the cold air, he said, "Walk to me." Ethan hesitated, glancing at Maya. She gave him a small nod. Slowly, one step at a time, the boy moved forward. His legs trembled, his balance wavered, but he didn't fall. When he reached his father, Charles's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something far more complicated. He lifted Ethan into his arms without a word and walked back toward the house, leaving Maya and Eleanor in the garden, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts. Eleanor's voice broke it at last. "He's not angry," she murmured. The quiet trials. In the days following that cold garden encounter, Maya could feel a shift in the mansion's rhythm, subtle but unmistakable. Charles Whitmore did not confront her again, nor did he forbid her from being near Ethan. Instead, he seemed to adopt a watch-and-wait approach, as if studying her under a magnifying glass. His sudden restraint was more unnerving than his open hostility. It meant he was planning something. He was a man who believed in control above all else, and allowing her continued access to his son could only mean one thing. He was testing her. The first test came quietly. One morning, Ethan was absent from breakfast. When Maya asked the kitchen staff, they told her Charles had taken him into the city for an appointment. By evening, Ethan returned exhausted, his face pale, his eyes heavy. The next morning, Charles arranged for Ethan to sit in the library with a stack of heavy books beside him, instructing Maya only to dust the shelves and leave him be. She obeyed outwardly, though she noticed how Ethan kept shifting in his chair, glancing at her every few minutes. It wasn't until Charles appeared unexpectedly at the doorway that she realized the setup. He had been watching from the hall, waiting to see if she would break the instruction and approach. She didn't. But later, when Charles left for a meeting, she quietly slid a soft cushion under Ethan's feet to ease the strain in his legs. Ethan's grateful smile was all the reward she needed. The second test was harder. 2 days later, Charles summoned Maya to the West Wing, an area of the mansion she rarely entered. The corridor was lined with family portraits, each one a study in power and status, and at the far end, Charles stood beside a small set of wooden stairs leading to a raised alcove. Ethan was there, looking uncertain. "If you believe you can help my son," Charles said, his voice calm, but his eyes sharp, "then help him climb." The challenge was deliberate. The stairs were too steep for Ethan's current strength, and Charles knew it. He folded his arms, leaning back to watch. Maya crouched beside Ethan, speaking softly so only he could hear. "We'll take it one step at a time. You stop when you need to, all right?" His small hand gripped hers tightly, and together they began. Each step was a battle. His legs shook, his breath quickened. But he pushed forward. By the fourth step, sweat dotted his forehead, and Maya could feel his muscles quivering under the strain. "You can rest," she whispered, but Ethan shook his head. Slowly, painfully, he reached the final step. When he did, he looked at his father, chest rising and falling rapidly. Charles didn't applaud. He didn't smile. But for the briefest second, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like pride, before it vanished behind his usual mask. "Take him back down," he said simply, turning on his heel and leaving them without another word. Maya didn't miss the fact that Eleanor had been standing in the shadows, watching every second, the suspicion of Charles Whitmore. For several days after Eleanor's cryptic comment, Maya found herself under a new kind of pressure, an invisible weight pressing on her every move. It wasn't just Eleanor's watchful gaze anymore. There was a shift in the air whenever Charles was in the room, a subtle but undeniable awareness. He had never been the kind of man to observe quietly. His presence was normally like a strike of thunder, loud, commanding, impossible to ignore. But lately, he had taken to watching her in silence from the head of the long mahogany dining table, his eyes unreadable as she moved about the room. Maya felt his attention even when her back was turned, and every instinct told her that Eleanor had spoken to him. Yet Charles didn't explode the way she expected. Instead, he asked questions in that deceptively calm tone that could chill the warmest day. "Has Ethan been more active lately?" he asked one morning as she poured his coffee. His eyes never left the newspaper in front of him, but Maya knew the question was not casual. She kept her hands steady and replied, "I wouldn't know, sir. I only see him during meals and lessons." Charles gave a small grunt, neither agreement nor suspicion confirmed, and returned to reading. But the next day, she noticed that he had moved Ethan's physical therapist sessions to earlier hours, when Maya was still working in the kitchens, almost as though testing to see if the boy's progress was tied to her presence. Despite the growing unease, Maya and Ethan's secret lessons continued. They had found a rhythm in the garden that neither wanted to break. Ethan's determination deepened, and with each passing day his steps became more confident. His arms no longer flailed for balance as much. His legs, once fragile and thin, began to hold more weight. The first time he managed to walk 6 full steps without her holding him, Maya felt a swell of pride so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You're getting stronger every day," she whispered, kneeling to meet his beaming face. But that joy was always shadowed by the looming fear of discovery. One chilly afternoon, that fear sharpened into near panic. They were in the garden, Ethan halfway through a careful lap between 2 benches, when the sound of slow, deliberate clapping broke through the quiet. Maya's head snapped up. Charles stood at the edge of the path, his tall frame cutting a dark silhouette against the pale winter light. His expression was impossible to read. There was no rage, no visible shock, only a strange stillness in his eyes as he watched his son take another uncertain step. Ethan froze, his mouth opening to explain, but Charles lifted a hand to silence him. "I wondered why my son has been restless lately," he said, his voice low but carrying across the garden. "It seems I've found my answer." He stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, and stopped just in front of them. "Tell me, Maya, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Maya felt her pulse quicken, but she straightened her back. "I'm helping him," she said simply, though her voice was calm only because she forced it to be. Charles's gaze flickered briefly to Ethan, then back to her. "Helping him?" he repeated as if tasting the words. "You think a maid can achieve what world-class doctors could not?" His tone was scathing, but beneath it Maya caught something else, a faint trace of curiosity, almost reluctant. Eleanor's arrival broke the tension. She strolled in from the side path, her usual grace intact, but her eyes carried a spark of mischief. Now, Charles," she said lightly. "Perhaps you should watch before you dismiss." Charles shot her a warning look, but she only sipped from her teacup, standing off to the side like an audience member who had been waiting for the performance to begin, the watcher behind the roses. The moment Maya saw the shadow slip past the hedge, her body tensed like a bowstring. She could tell by the slow, deliberate steps that whoever it was had been standing there long enough to watch. Her mind raced through possibilities. One of the gardeners, a house staff member, or worse, Charles himself. The morning sun cast sharp beams through the rose leaves, dappled light falling across Ethan's face as he looked up at her with a mix of trust and fear. She squeezed his hand, silently willing him to stay calm. The footsteps grew louder, crunching on the gravel path, and then the figure emerged. Eleanor Whitmore, Charles's younger sister. Eleanor was a woman who seemed carved from the same expensive stone as the mansion, flawless, polished, and cold. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight chignon, and a silk scarf rested neatly at her collarbone. In her gloved hands she held a porcelain teacup, sipping with deliberate grace as her sharp blue eyes swept over the scene before her. She did not speak immediately, which was worse than if she had shouted. Instead, she let the silence stretch, the weight of her gaze pressing on Maya's back. "Well," Eleanor finally said, her voice soft but laced with an edge, Isn't this interesting? She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the stone, and crouched slightly to meet Ethan's eyes. Practicing your steps, darling? How ambitious. Ethan glanced at Maya, his lips parting to answer, but she gave a subtle shake of her head. Eleanor noticed, of course. Eleanor noticed everything. Straightening, she fixed her stare on Maya. You do realize my brother doesn't approve of experiments. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced her tone to remain neutral. He asked me to help him tie his shoelace, Miss Whitmore. That's all. It was a half-truth, and she knew Eleanor could see right through it, but the older woman only hummed, swirling the tea in her cup. If that's all, then you won't mind me mentioning it to Charles. I'm sure he'll be curious. The pause before that last word was deliberate, and in it, Maya heard the unspoken threat. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. Eleanor said nothing more, but her presence seemed to linger everywhere. At the breakfast table, in the hallways, by the garden gates. She would watch Ethan with a faint, knowing smile, and each time Maya's stomach knotted tighter. The boy, however, surprised her. Instead of withdrawing, he became more determined, as though the threat of discovery had only made him want to succeed faster. His steps grew steadier, his legs stronger. Some mornings he could take 4 or 5 strides without faltering, his face glowing with pride. But Maya could not ignore the danger. If Eleanor truly intended to tell Charles, it was only a matter of time before their fragile progress was destroyed. That fear gnawed at her, keeping her awake in the small hours of the night. She imagined Charles storming into the garden, ripping Ethan away again, his voice filled with the same contempt that had soaked her clothes in humiliation. She couldn't let that happen, not when Ethan was so close to proving everyone wrong. Then one evening, as Maya cleared the dinner table, Eleanor drifted into the dining room. The other staff had already gone, leaving the air heavy with the scent of roasted duck and wine. Eleanor set down her empty teacup beside Maya's tray, leaning in just enough for her perfume to mix with the fading aroma of food. "You're braver than I expected," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. Or perhaps just foolish. Her eyes held Maya's for a moment before she turned and left, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Whispers in the garden. The rest of that afternoon was a blur for Maya, but one image refused to leave her mind. Ethan's face, pale and frightened, peeking over his father's shoulder as Charles carried him away. The boy's eyes weren't just sad, they were pleading for her to stay, to not vanish like everyone else who had ever cared for him. Maya had seen that look before, in her younger brother, the night he was left behind in the hospital ward because her mother couldn't afford the treatment. It was the look of someone who had given up on being saved, and that, she decided, was something she would never allow Ethan to feel again. Her uniform was still damp as she returned to her small room tucked behind the kitchen. The Whitmore mansion was vast, with marble floors that seemed to stretch for miles and ceilings so high they could hold secrets in their shadows. But for Maya, it was not a home. It was a place where every step had to be calculated, every word weighed. She changed quickly, wringing out the last drops from her hair, and sat on the narrow bed. She thought of quitting, packing her things and leaving before Charles could humiliate her again. Yet the image of Ethan, trembling on his unsteady legs, burned away that thought. Walking away would be easy. Staying, that would be the fight. Over the next week, Maya worked in silence, keeping to the edges of the house like a shadow. Charles rarely spoke to her, though she could feel his cold eyes on her whenever she passed. But Ethan sought her out. At breakfast, he would glance over the rim of his cereal bowl until she caught his eye, and a faint smile would pass between them. In the garden, when Charles's attention was pulled elsewhere, Ethan would slowly inch toward her, each step hesitant but determined. And then, in a moment so small it could have been missed, he whispered to her, "Will you help me? Again?" The question nearly broke her. She knelt beside him, pretending to adjust the collar of his shirt, and whispered back, "Only if you promise not to tell anyone." His nod was solemn, almost adult, as though he understood the weight of their secret. From that day, a quiet rhythm began between them. In the early mornings, before Charles's footsteps echoed through the halls, Maya would find Ethan in the small garden at the far end of the property, the one hidden by the tall hedge of roses. The air there was different, softer, carrying the scent of earth and dew. She would take his hands in hers, feeling the tremble in his fingers as he tried to steady himself. "We'll go slow," she'd say, her voice low enough that even the birds couldn't carry it to curious ears. Each step was a battle, his knees wobbling, his breath quickening, but she never let him fall. She learned to read the signs, the slight dip of his head when he grew tired, the sharp inhale when pain flared in his joints, and when he managed a full step without her support, she would praise him quietly, watching pride flicker in his eyes. Ethan began to change. His shoulders straightened, his gaze lifted. He laughed more, a sound that startled the gardeners who had grown used to his silence. Yet the more progress they made, the greater Maya's fear grew. She knew that if Charles discovered what they were doing, the consequences would be severe, not just for her, but for Ethan too. Charles was a man who measured worth in power and control, and nothing threatened him more than someone proving he could be wrong. One morning, as they practiced in the garden, Maya heard the faint creak of the iron gate. Her pulse spiked. She turned just in time to see a figure moving through the hedge, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Ethan's hand tightened in hers, and in that instant she knew their fragile secret might be about to shatter. The courtyard incident. The koi pond shimmered under the midday sun, the soft sound of water trickling over stones. Maya Williams knelt on the wet marble, her hands gently holding Ethan's tiny arms. His legs trembled, knees shaking as if they carried the weight of the world. "You're doing so well," she whispered, her voice low and warm. "Just one more step, Ethan. You can do it." The boy's lips curled into a shy smile. He had never walked without help, but today, something felt different. He wanted to try. For her. Then came the sound. The heavy, polished steps of Charles Whitmore echoing across the courtyard like a warning. Maya stiffened, her hands still bracing Ethan. She didn't have to look up to know the expression on his face. "Get out, you filthy black maid! What are you doing to my son?" The venom in his voice cut through the warm afternoon like ice. Ethan flinched, wobbling. Maya's throat tightened, but she held her ground. She began, but Charles was already there, his shadow falling over them. With one swift motion, he tore Ethan from her hands. The boy gasped as his father's grip closed around him. Then, with a shove, Charles sent Maya backward. Her heels slipped on the slick marble. She fell into the shallow koi basin, the cold water shocking her skin. The sweet perfume of lilies was replaced by the sharp taste of humiliation. She stood, soaked, water dripping down her hair and uniform. "Mr. Whitmore, I was only what?" His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Only putting your hands on my son as if you have the right? I don't care what excuse you've cooked up. I've seen your kind, always trying to inch into places you don't belong." Maya's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "I was helping him walk." Charles's laugh was low and mocking. "Helping? Don't insult my intelligence. I've spent millions on the best doctors, the finest therapy. If they couldn't make him walk, you—" He sneered, his eyes raking over her. "Certainly can't." Ethan stirred in his father's arms, his small voice trembling. "Daddy." She was just... But Charles silenced him with a cold glare. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle splash of koi tails in the water. Maya stood there, dripping, staring at the man who held all the power, and the boy whose eyes silently begged her not to give up. Inside her, something hardened.